Prison overcrowding has been discussed as being a big problem for those reasons. I would suggest to you that prison overcrowding is, in fact, not the problem, but a symptom of the problem. The problem is that we have a revolving door. In California, on an annual basis, we release 120,000 prisoners because they have served their time. Within 3 years of their release, 70% reoffend, 70% recidivate. It's the highest recidivism rate in the country, but not by far. I would suggest to you the one most effective issue that we could address on this issue of prison overcrowding is this issue of recidivism, this revolving door where known offenders keep coming in and going out and coming back in. And let me put that point in context. Do you know that in California, the average prison sentence is 24 months? I would suggest to you that you can infer two other facts from that statistic. One, most people who are going to prison are going in for nonviolent crime. Because when you commit a murder, when you commit a rape, when you molest a child, it's not 24 months. It's a much longer period of time. So one, we know that we've got a lot of people being sentenced for nonviolent crime. The other thing we know, and that fact and statistic tells us, they're all coming out. However, we have criminal justice policy that basically goes like this. Person commits a crime, let's arrest him, let's prosecute him, send him to jail. Good, done with that guy. We can now move on. Instead of realizing that there's another chapter in that book. He's coming out in 24 months, and we don't have a plan for him. And chances are 7 out of 10, he's going to go right back in. And let me tell you, that last chapter that we overlook and don't bother to read is a really expensive chapter. It costs $10,000 every time I prosecute a felony. It costs $35,000 a year to house someone in the county jail. It costs $49,000 a year to house someone in the state prison. Back on Track, the initiative that I described, costs less than $5,000 per participant. We have got to address this issue of recidivism and recognize that the perfect antidote is to invest in reentry initiatives, such as what we've done in San Francisco with Back on Track. Re-entering, recognize that we have people who will be coming out because they have served their time. They should have been locked up because there should be consequence for crime. But once they have been punished as appropriate, we have to recognize they're coming back, and we've got to have a plan for bringing them back in a way that they don't commit another crime against us. And so that is actually why we also wrote the bill, that we were happy to see had a lot of bipartisan support. And I'm going to just go on to say that I also believe very strongly that one of the other impediments to smarter criminal justice policy, I believe, is that we have for too long been discussing criminal justice policy through an ideological lens instead of talking about it in terms of what just makes practical sense. I would suggest to you that to be smart on crime means to recognize that these are really not only bipartisan issues, they're for the most part nonpartisan issues. Everybody wants to be safe. And I have never seen a robber walk up to their victim and say, okay, what party do you belong to, before they decide whether they're going to commit the crime.
Thank you. We have several questions, which one questioner succinctly summarizes. Will you comment on how your stand on the death penalty may affect your candidacy for Attorney General?
Sure. I am personally opposed to the death penalty, but I will follow the law. And my position on the death penalty is the same as 4 of the last 9 elected attorneys general of California, including the current one.
That was quick.
Succinct begets succinct, I hope.
This is a more nuanced question, which I think is rather intriguing. It's 2 parts.
Okay.
Doesn't a criminal conviction in and of itself work against some of the rehabilitative goals you have of your ex-offenders, does that create a conflict for you in your role as a prosecutor? And by way of comparison, New Jersey is considering legislation that would no longer require job seekers to disclose convictions on applications for positions that they're seeking. Would you comment on those?
Sure, that's great. Great question, and thank you. So I often think to offer a quick maybe point of reference about the first question in the context of this concept called redemption. So redemption is, I think, a fairly age-old concept that transcends religion. And it's a simple point, which is this: everybody makes a mistake at some point or another, and that mistake may rise to the level of being a crime. And everyone should be held accountable when they make a mistake, and the appropriate consequence should occur. And especially when somebody commits a crime, they need to be held accountable and they must suffer a consequence. But after they have done their time, so to speak, we as a civil society must provide a mechanism and a way for them to earn back their position among us. And to that point, again, I will say that I think we have to reject false choices. There must be accountability. But beyond that, let's be smart and recognize that after one has been held accountable, we have to provide a way for them to come back. So nothing I am saying suggests that someone should be forgiven without consequence for committing a crime. You commit a crime, you have to be held accountable. But there is life after that. And there are steps we can take after that person has been held accountable to achieve our goals of public safety. And so, for example, in Back on Track, we require the offender to plead guilty. Why? Because he's guilty, right? The guy was out there slinging drugs on the corner. And some people would like to suggest it's a victimless crime. I would tell you it's not. You were guilty. You were out there. And by the way, I don't feel sorry for you. And I am not going to forgive you for committing a crime. But I do know what you're capable of after you've been held accountable. So let's get on the path of dealing with that also. On the second point, the New Jersey initiative, I think to move the issue of reentry forward in a way that we can institutionalize it and encourage the models to develop and replication, we have to create incentives. I've been very fortunate to be the district attorney of San Francisco because I live in a city and in a community where, you pick up the phone and call people and they take your call and you ask them for help and they always say yes. And even if they don't really know where you're going with an idea, they come to meet with you and then you kind of figure it out. So when we first created Back on Track, I called up members of the Chamber of Commerce, Stephen Falk and others, called up heads of the Labor Council. And I said, I've got an idea, come and talk with me. They said, okay, Kamala, we don't know exactly what you're talking about, but we'll come on board. And our local businesses and a lot of our family-owned and small businesses said, we'll take on these former offenders because we know that what you're doing with them before they come to this job site and when they leave here is you're working on their parenting skills, you're clearing their credit. That's one of the aspects of Back on Track. You're dealing with the fact that they need to have stable housing. And so in many ways, our employers figured out through a process of just working with us that these individuals who are in Back on Track, these former offenders, are kind of like those guys holding the cell phone in a Verizon commercial. Have you ever watched that? Where there's the one guy on his little cell phone and then there are hundreds of people behind him, and that's his support network. These people who we're talking about in these reentry programs are so highly motivated because they want to prove themselves. And we've got all of these checks and balances going on behind the scenes to make sure that they are motivated and actually that they're actually covering all the bases that you hope the guy answering the want ad is having covered. So so it's worked in San Francisco, but more indirectly to answer the question, one way that we can move it forward, and what some people have talked about, is let's create tax incentives and other types of incentives through the law to encourage businesses to take on these populations in a way that that achieves the ultimate goal. And so the New Jersey law about requiring people to report convictions, I haven't read it. I would want to know whether they're making the distinction between violent and nonviolent crime, which I think is an important distinction to always make.
Well, it's interesting because the New York Times on Christmas Day wrote a big editorial about the prospect of smart on crime,
Hmm.
basically adopting your
Hmm.
philosophy and saying that reentry was such a essential component of reducing the recidivism rate. So they were right on track. They were back on track with you. Um, I would like to remind you, you're listening to the Commonwealth Club of California radio program, and our guest today is Kamala Harris, San Francisco District Attorney, who is discussing how to reduce crime in California and indeed